Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Donald Trump speaking to reporters for the first time since July, and this just 8 days before he's sworn in as the 45th president of the United States. We're talking about it in the company of Molly McHugh, foreign policy consultant who recently wrote for Politico a column entitled Putin's Really Long Game. She is in Washington from Philadelphia. Welcome back to Michael Johns, former speechwriter for George W. Bush, a co-founder of the Tea Party National Movement, and who is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And here in the studio, former U.S. diplomat William Jordan. Welcome back to all of you. We were talking just before the break how at that first press conference in a long while, Trump rolling out a legal counsel to talk about how he's going to unwind his business ties from his political ones. Time magazine came up with a map of all of Trump's foreign business interests ahead of the inauguration. Yes, everywhere where there's those red dots, including inside of the United States. Now, we've reported, for instance, about his new Trump Hotel in Washington in the old post office building, a landmark that's owned by the government. So he'll be the renter and the owner at the same time, or at least his sons will under the New Deal. Now, on the eve of Trump's election, the Philippines president, Rodrigo Duterte, naming local real estate magnate Jose Ibi Antonio as his new envoy to Washington. Antonio, who happens to be William Jordan, his business partner. What is that? Is this an unprecedented situation where you have a man who is the business partner who's also going to be the envoy of the Philippines to the United States?
I am not aware of anything similar to this, at least not being presented in this way, where you have somebody who's an actual former partner of the president-elect of the United States being named to such a position. I mean, look, there are so many areas here that are potential landmines as far as the ethics and integrity of the presidency of the United States are concerned, as well as the image of the United States as it is manifested in the President of the United States. I don't know where to begin, but I will say that I think that at a minimum, while I applaud Trump for having made an effort when he has made a very strong case so far that he's not actually bound by the Constitution legally or by law to conform to the same rules and regulations that every other government official has to in the United States. Nevertheless, you know, he took a considerable amount of time in this press conference today to sort of roll out all of this. I think, however, his attorney needs to now have a press conference of her own explaining in even more juicy detail exactly what are the actual details here. And that's going to have to be followed up, and this is all going to have to be monitored. And the reason for this is very, very simple. The United States, looking around the world in terms of its foreign dealings and in terms of what the law of the United States demands of the United States officials from the president down in terms of personal integrity, what we expect other leaders and other countries to do in terms of transparency and in terms of accountability. If the American president is seen to be no more honest than former Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, that's a serious problem for the United States. And it further undercuts the ability of the United States to speak to other countries and in a way, pass judgment on other countries and other leaders in terms of their conduct, no matter how egregious it might be.
Right. It'll be a problem for the United States' reputation abroad, Molly McHugh, but we heard in the press conference when one reporter, for instance, asked him why hasn't he still released his tax returns, he said, hey, I won the election. The voters don't care.
Right. So I think, Mr. Jordan just highlighted a really good point, which is that Trump repeated today, I think, the most important line about any of the business part of the press conference, that the rules don't actually apply to him. And I think this is important because this type of rhetoric, the idea that rules and laws don't apply to certain individuals, is also how people like Vladimir Putin operate in the world. And I think sometimes the similarity of discourse is what unnerves those of us that work on these policy areas. These are sort of the explicit Russian objectives in the world to remove a rules-based liberal democratic world order, to undermine NATO, to undermine the possibilities of American power. And when you have some of these talking points coming from the president-elect and sometimes coming from some members of his team, then it sort of creates this echoey dissonance that is very unnerving. I think the more Trump can clearly articulate specific policies, particularly about Russia in this instance, the better off that he'll be in assuaging critics and moving past these allegations if it is true that there's no meat behind any of them.
Michael Johns, he's not yet the president. Is he above the law, or are we going to hear a different Donald Trump after January the 20th?
No, and let's be perfectly clear. He is abiding by every obligation that he has under U.S. law, U.S. regulation, FEC guidelines that govern his campaign. There is no documentable or even suggestive evidence that
but for instance, there's no blind trust. In the past, 9 out of 12 previous presidents established such trusts to distance themselves from their business interests.
Well, in essence, that is in essence what was announced today, is that he has reassigned his corporate and other responsibilities and is no longer involved or affiliated with this company.
But that's not a blind trust. Those are his sons. That's a seeing-eye trust, I suppose you would call it.
The point he made, which I don't want to be misinterpreted, is that the steps that he took, and this might be a glaring loophole or oversight that should be addressed. We haven't really confronted this since like Rockefeller, to be honest, with someone who's had such complex personal holdings. But his steps today go above and beyond that of which he is legally obligated to do. And that was, I think, the point he was making, not that he's exempt from the Constitution, but that the Constitution itself does not mandate of the presidency that of which it does, other officials necessarily. And he's taken the step of disengaging to the extent it can be done so, short of, the sort of fire sale of a massive complex organization, which is not even reasonable or practical.
Right. Caroline Frederickson in part one saying that he could do more, but I want to get to the point where Molly McHugh was mentioning, which is the one about on the world stage, what it means for U.S. clout and U.S. foreign policy. You heard William Jordan saying that he puts himself in a position where he could be likened to Tunisia's former strongman, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali.
Well,
there's already this weird sense that if you stay in the Trump Hotel in Washington, you'll have better access, or there's still a way to do a business deal with the Trump organization that may be advantageous to you. Now, I don't think Trump is himself promoting that. I'm not sure if other members of his businesses are. And it is the way that other places in the world operate. So it's like this is the language that they speak.
Michael Johns.
And he needs to dissuade that.
He actually clarified that today in the press conference, saying that any proceeds that were derived from any official diplomatic, government, foreign business to any entity within the Trump administration would be essentially given back to the U.S. Treasury. So there's absolutely zero personal gain, and he's personally committed himself to doing that. And let me be clear. Let's talk about what's really at the core of all this. The United States Democratic Party, progressive movement in this country, throughout the world even, did not want this man to become president. They did everything they could to stop him from becoming president, and they are shocked that he has become president. And these are, in many respects, desperate efforts. The 35-page report, for instance, that you referenced is not an intelligence report. It's a report that was official opposition research conducted by his political opponents. It was designed to be politically damaging to him. Now it's been put out, and it's being denounced by essentially not just Trump and the Trump transition team, as they've correctly done, but also by just about every media outlet that's looked at the contents of it as being.
But he took a direct shot at one point, not just at those media organizations, but he also took a shot at his own intelligence services, saying they were using tactics likening to Nazi Germany. I'll just read you what the White House says. They say the criticism of U.S. spies is, quote, deeply misguided, Michael Johns.
Okay, I think what we're talking about are formal briefings that the president-elect has received on intelligence matters that have appeared in the media. And that almost certainly have come from U.S. intelligence reports. This was the essence of, Obama, who really hasn't, frankly, been concerned about Russian aggression for the last 8 years, rapidly moving to impose sanctions and release this report on the influence on the hacking and whatnot. It's all essentially at the core of it designed to be suggestive of some degree of lack of legitimacy of this man's election, which, by the way, he has won overwhelmingly among the American people, including states that I don't even think the most, sympathetic political analysts ever conceived that he would win.
All right, let's talk about the fact that Donald Trump, his own personal business interests are one thing, and then there are the relationships his cabinet members have had with foreign powers. It was the first day of confirmation hearings for Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, the former boss of Exxon, who insists he severed all ties with Moscow. He was stationed there in the past. The Wall Street Journal describes him as a tough negotiator, but one who bet big on Putin and Russia with huge reserves. It spent decades developing at a cost you can count in the billions. For now, the tap is almost entirely off. That's because of sanctions imposed by the Obama administration over Ukraine. There you see on that chart Exxon's major holdings in Russia, and the little dot below it is how much oil they in fact are extracting these days from Russia itself. So Exxon is hurt quite a bit by what's going on. Again, Rex Tillerson insisting that he's severed all ties, and also saying sanctions should remain for now. He got quite a grilling, including from some senators who were former opponents of Donald Trump on the campaign trail.
Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible for ordering the murder of countless dissidents, journalists, and political opponents?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible, or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
Well, people who speak up for freedom in regimes that are repressive are often at threat, and these things happen to them. In terms of assigning specific responsibilities, I would have to have more information. As I indicated, I feel it's important that in advising the president, if confirmed, that I deal with facts, that I deal with sufficient information, which means having access to all information. And I'm sure there's a large body of information that I've never seen that's in the classified realm. I look forward, if confirmed, to becoming fully informed, but I am not willing to make conclusions on what is only publicly available or have been publicly reported.
None of this is classified, Mr. Tillerson. These people are dead.
William Jordan, how do diplomats feel about the prospect of a Secretary of State Tillerson?
You know, I don't think there's a great deal of disquiet among diplomats having Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And I think the performance today shows why. I mean, I do think that notwithstanding, and I would have had a hard time answering that question, myself, simply because if you don't have access to all of the information in the classified as well as the unclassified realm, I mean, you can make a sort of a prima facie assumption or assertion, but you don't have the benefit of all the information. And I think I don't think he's trying to weasel out, given some of the other things that he said where he was very critical of Russia. I don't think he's trying to get away from answering the question or pointing the finger of blame at Putin and at Russia where it's necessary. But I think he's trying to be very careful and trying to be very cautious, given the fact that he hasn't yet become Secretary of State and he's got to worry about all of his future relationships. I think, though, that as far as the State Department is concerned, I mean, we've had in the not too distant past with George Shultz, a major CEO coming in from the private sector, taking over the State Department. I think that most people would listen to what Tillerson said today and say, okay, this is a guy who is very forceful, is very dynamic. He's got a good sense of what he wants and of leadership, and let's give him a chance. Let's see how he does. I think the real question for a lot of people in the State Department is going to be, who does he bring in with him from outside And how much is that going to prevent him from listening to people within the State Department in terms of hearing their views, especially on Russia, but also who is going to be imposed on the State Department and on Tillerson from the White House in terms of, the deputies and the assistant secretaries and the undersecretaries who will be working for Tillerson.
Molly McHugh, your thoughts on this? And also, did you get the sense that Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson have the same view of Russia?
So I think those are sort of the two aspects. I do agree that there were actually some very encouraging things in Tillerson's hearing this morning, and we were all splitting screens, so nobody saw everything. But I think there's sort of two portfolios of things to look at. One, he was very strong in responding to the idea that Russia has been using revanchist tactics against the West, that the only way to confront this is sort of standing from a position of strength, that the United States should have stood more firmly with Ukraine after the annexation or the seizure of Crimea, and that we should not have allowed Russia to take more territory in eastern Ukraine, that we should be moving forward with our defense deployments and other commitments to NATO allies in the Baltics and in Poland and in looking at other regional security apparatuses. His answers on those questions, for those of us that look at this stuff all the time, were pretty awesome, and that's a good place for him to start. I think the concern on the other side is this continued, well, there's issues where we just need to work with Russia, which granted is true in a diplomatic sense on certain issues, but I do not include cooperation with Russia to fight ISIS in that portfolio, because there is such overwhelming evidence that Russia has not done very much to fight ISIS and has used the excuse of fighting ISIS as a way to empower Assad and advance their own interests in Syria and Iraq and the Middle East. And I think, but the other part of everything that Tillerson was saying that needs to be taken with a grain of salt is very much that he would not speak to what the president-elect's policy and his specific policy views, especially toward Russia, will be. So that is something that we need to consider, and again, why Trump needs to very clearly articulate what he believes his positions are going to be.
I think it was the final question of the press conference, Molly, where the Trump press conference, where he said that Putin would respect him because he's strong. Do you think Putin will respect Donald Trump?
I think the assertion that Putin respects strength is true. I think everybody who deals with Russia believes that. I think Putin's views on Trump very much remain to be seen. I think in one of the earlier responses there was sort of a back and forth on whether or not these memos that have been put out could have been sourced from Russian intelligence. Even if that were to be true, think about what that means. That means one way or the other, Russia wants to create the perception that they have leverage over Donald Trump, and either wants to discredit that completely so people stop asking questions about it, or just have that uncertainty out there so that it divides the way the American populace looks at their incoming leader and divides the way he can deal with his allies in the world. This is Putin's Russia. It is not a warfare tactic that we understand, but these are the hybrid warfare tactics of the current Russian security state against the United States of America and our people and our allies in the world, and we need to be much more open-eyed about how we see them and how we confront them.
That's a point that's going to have ears pricking up in this country. We have a presidential election coming up. In Germany, they have elections coming up later this year.
Absolutely.
Are you saying, in effect, that, well, if you have multi-party democracy, it makes you an easy target for Putin?
I think anyone with open systems, anyone who relies on the idea of an open system is a target. And I think if you looked at the intelligence community's declassified report that was put out at the end of last week, one of the conclusions was, now that Russia has tried these tactics in the United States, and it's not just hacking, we all need to stop calling it hacking. It's not just hacking, it was a complex information and influence operation designed to change how Americans think about their government and their society and their potential politicians. But if you look at that type of operation, they will use it again against American and Western allies. I think the thing that was missing from that statement is that they have done it before. And until you understand the operation that happened in this country in the context of what Russia has been doing in its near abroad and other places for the last 8 years, it's really hard to understand how these tactics evolved, how they are meant to work, and how they impacted us. I think France is absolutely part of this style of information operation. Germany has very clearly been put in the target as well. And you definitely see aggressive Russian tactics in a variety of Eastern and Western European capitals to try to change how we think about ourselves. And this is what their subversion tactics aim to achieve, changing the way that we look at our societies and our values without us really understanding what just happened. And that's why it's so hard for us to wrap our minds around, why you will continually have denial about how these tactics worked and what they did. And for an incoming President Trump, I think it's important for him to understand that this wasn't just a Russian operation to help him or not, to influence, to work against Clinton or not. They built information architecture within our country that they can use again, and they will if it is not exposed and confronted and we understand exactly how they do these things.
All right, so much more to say on this topic. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Molly McHugh, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. Michael Johns in Philadelphia. I also want to thank William Jordan. Stay with us, though. Our